morning again, Sunday School families, and welcome back to another week of virtual Sunday School. I hope you've all had a wonderful week. As you can see, my medicine wheel from last week is hanging up here in the background, and I hope you had a chance to watch the video last week all about the medicine wheel, and I hope you had a chance to make your own medicine wheels that are hopefully hanging in a place where you can see them every day. Now this week we're going to pray as always. I'm going to introduce this week's lesson with a Bible verse that we all should know or hopefully know and have heard before. And then we're going to do what's called a blanket exercise. Now families, if you're watching this lesson along with your children, I really encourage you to participate in the blanket exercise with your child or with your children. You really get the most out of this blanket exercise when you do it with other people and when you have a chance after each step to reflect on how each step makes you feel and to sort of talk about your feelings at each of the various steps of the blanket exercise. Now, as we go through, I'll show you a visual of me doing the blanket exercise, and I hope that you can do it along with me. And after each step, I'm going to put a visual up on the screen that's going to show a happy face and a sad face. And I'd like you to take that moment to either pause the video for a few moments and also reflect on the reflection question that I'll provide. But at the very least, I'd like you to check in with yourselves and decide, am I feeling happy or am I feeling sad? And families, this sort of happy or sad little check-in after each step of the blanket exercise is really an invitation and an opportunity to continue a reflective discussion on the really, really important things that we'll be talking about and experiencing in the blanket exercise. Now, before we get into this week's prayer and really get our lesson started, I'm going to give you some instructions about how to set up your blanket exercise so that it can be all set up when we're ready to pray and get into the lesson. Okay, so for this exercise, for this activity, you're going to need a couple or a few different blankets. I'm going to need you to lay those out in a place where you can move around, a place where you can walk around freely. Just lay them on the ground so they're touching one another. And I'm also going to ask you to gather 5 items that are very special to you. Now, this could be a stuffed animal, it could be a toy, it could be a photo of you and something that's special to you, maybe a photo of your family, or it could be any other sort of physical object that you can place on the blanket. So if you'd like to pause the video right now and get yourself all settled, then we'll come back and we'll pray together. Great, so now that your blanket exercise is all set up, we're going to pray together using our voices and our bodies. Repeat after me. Loving God, thank you for the land where we worship and all our Treaty 6 friends. Thank you for the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have walked this land for generations. Help me today and all days to walk together in love through Jesus. Amen. So as we get started today on activity number 2 from the Presbyterian Church in Canada's Reconciliation Activities for Children, I'd like to ground us and center us and sort of focus what we're going to do today all around a verse in the Bible that I hope many of you have heard before. It comes from Matthew chapter 7, and this is verse 12. So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. Now you may know this verse or something similar to it as the golden rule. Treat others how you would like to be treated. Now I'd like you to think about what that really means. How would you like others to treat you? What are some ways that you'd like others to treat you? Probably you'd like them to treat you with kindness, with love, with respect. And what does that mean, to treat you with respect? To respect your language and your culture and your way of understanding the world, and probably to respect your friends and family and other things about your culture and community, right? Now, I'd like you to keep that in mind as we jump into today's activity, and that is called a blanket exercise. Now, some of you may have participated in a blanket exercise before, either at church or maybe at your school you've participated in a blanket exercise. Now, this is going to be an exercise where we travel through time together. We're going to imagine that we're moving through time and space, and we're going to learn about the story, the history of Canada. Okay, so you're gonna have to use your imagination and listen very, very carefully to the narration that I'm giving to help your imagination really put you in the many different times and places that we're gonna travel to together, okay? So I ask at this time that you move to where you've set up your blanket, and I'm going to start the blanket exercise now. I'd like to ask you all to stand on the edge of your blankets, remove your shoes if you're wearing any, and stand up nice and tall. I'd like you to close your eyes and take 3 deep breaths. In through your nose, out through your mouth. In through your nose, out through your mouth. In through your nose and out through your mouth. I'd like you to imagine yourself traveling thousands of years back in time. Now you may open your eyes and walk around your blankets slowly. Imagine that these blankets are the land that Indigenous people lived on. Imagine that it's 10,000 years ago. These blankets make up the land we call Canada, but before it was called Canada, it had another name, Turtle Island. There are no cities or highways or buildings like we have today. Look at the rivers and lakes, the ocean shore, the forests and fields, hills and valleys. Imagine what Turtle Island is like. It's long before anyone arrived from Europe. Turtle Island was home to millions of Indigenous people who lived in hundreds of different nations and communities. They had their own languages, cultures, traditions, laws, and governments. When the nations disagreed with each other, they ended fights by making promises called treaties. We believe the Creator will take care of us if we take care of this land and each other. Now we're going to time travel to 500 years ago. The people on Turtle Island have found new people on their lands. The kings and queens in Europe were looking for new places to live and rule over. Their sailors explored the ocean. There were no airplanes. They came to Turtle Island. Walk around the edge of the blankets. Imagine new people called explorers visiting your home and land. Pretend to greet them. The newcomers looked and sounded and behaved very differently than Indigenous people. They needed help to find their way around and to survive the cold winters. Indigenous people taught them how to live here so that they would know too. Sometimes Indigenous people and the European newcomers made promises to each other, treaties as to how they will peacefully share the land, plants, water, and animals. Indigenous people taught them how to have enough to eat, how to hunt and fish, what plants are safe to eat, and medicines that can be used when you're sick. Indigenous people taught them to form a circle and talk about important things. Now we are going to time travel to the beginning of the 1800s. This was 220 years ago. Life on Turtle Island is changing. There are more new people from Europe than there are indigenous people, and more people keep coming. One of the reasons that there are fewer indigenous people is because the new people had sicknesses that indigenous people never had, and so their bodies could not fight them. Some of these diseases were called smallpox, measles, and tuberculosis. Many indigenous people got very sick. Imagine having many people in our families and communities getting sick. This might have been your family members and friends. To help us imagine, I'd like you to remove one of your special items from the blanket and put them in a place where you can no longer see them. We will now remember those who got sick and died. Remember the families and communities who loved and missed those people. Sometimes it's sad to hear about and imagine this part of history. Remember that there are many strong indigenous people today. Remember that this part of history is just as important as remembering the parts that make us happy. Now let's travel to when Canada was formed. We've traveled back 154 years. In 1867, non-Indigenous people gave part of Turtle Island a new name called Canada, and they made a government and made up rules for people to live by. This new Parliament of Canada was very different than Indigenous governments. The Canadian government decided on rules differently than Indigenous people, and the government thought their laws were more important than the laws and rules of Indigenous people. Do you remember when the new people first arrived and we made promises to each other? What were those called? Treaties. Indigenous people believe treaties are important agreements, but the new laws didn't follow the rules Indigenous people agreed to in the treaties. Treaties talked about sharing land. Non-Indigenous people wanted more land, so they made new laws that said that Indigenous people could only live on small pieces of land called reserves, and they couldn't leave the reserves. To help us imagine this, fold your blankets up so that they're separated from one another, and there's just enough room for you and your special items to stand there. For Indigenous people, this change was really hard. They couldn't fish or hunt in the same places. All the things that were familiar in the trees, in the water, in the plants and animals changed. And for many, this meant that they couldn't get enough food. Some became very hungry and sick. To help us imagine, I'd like you to sit down on the edge of your blanket because you are one of the Indigenous people who is hungry and weak. It is sad to learn about and to imagine this time in history. Today, Indigenous people are strong people and they teach us about Turtle Island and the people who were here first. Back in time to 100 years ago, the part of Turtle Island that Indigenous people can walk on has become much smaller. Many people got sick from diseases and some got hungry because Indigenous people couldn't hunt and fish like they used to. About 100 years ago, many Indigenous children were sent to school. Indigenous children went to a different kind of school. They went to a residential school, which means that they had to leave their homes and live at the schools. For a lot of kids, this meant that they didn't get to see their parents and grandparents while they were at school. The Government of Canada wanted Indigenous children to become like other Canadians. They wanted them to speak the same languages, to live in the same places, and to forget that our families do things differently. Because of these schools, Indigenous people forgot many of the things their parents and grandparents taught them about where they came from, how they lived, and even their language. Because students at these schools lost their Indigenous languages, many couldn't talk with their parents when they went home. From September to June, families and communities don't hear the voices and laughter and singing of children. And at the schools, the children missed their families and their home and the places where they played, the water they canoed on, and the forest paths they walked on. To help us imagine, I'd like you to turn away from all of your special items so you can no longer see them. Let's time travel one last time to about 13 years ago in 2008. This was when the Prime Minister of Canada apologized to Indigenous people. The Prime Minister said it was wrong to send children to schools away from their parents and said sorry that the Government of Canada did this. All right, well, welcome back, everyone. We have successfully completed our blanket exercise together. And you'll notice that I'm now wearing a little button here, a little pin that I've made for myself. I've just made this out of construction paper and a safety pin. And it says on it, I did the blanket exercise. And so I encourage you to make a little pin for yourself. You can make it with paper, or if you're feeling really fancy, if you have some sort of maybe fabric or something else that you can make into a fancier pin, you can certainly do that and decorate it however you'd like. And when you feel comfortable or confident, you could put your pin on, and maybe when you're seeing other people in the world, maybe at school or in other places, you can wear your pin proudly, and then you know when someone says, what's a blanket exercise? Hopefully you'll feel confident in talking about what your experience was like in the blanket exercise and what you learned from that experience. And let's talk about what we learned together. I'm sure many of you felt some emotions while we were doing the exercise, and that's really good. That's really normal to feel lots of different feelings. And what's really great is when you can have the opportunity to talk about those feelings with your family and with others. So I hope you've also had an opportunity to do that throughout the exercise, or maybe families, this is an opportunity after the video to have a deeper conversation about all of these issues. Now, I'd like to bring us back to the Bible verse that we talked about at the beginning of the lesson. And that reminds us of the golden rule, to treat others the way we want to be treated. So I'd like you to think back to the blanket exercise and think to yourself, were the people in that story, the Indigenous people and the Europeans, were they treating each other how they wanted to be treated? Were they following the golden rule? We know in the beginning for sure the Indigenous people were helping the Europeans, teaching them how to survive in the cold winters and making promises with them about how to share the land peacefully, making treaties. Remember the word treaties? But what about the Europeans? And what about the Canadian government later with the making of reserves and with residential schools? That's not really following the golden rule, is it? To cause harm and pain and hurt to the many Indigenous communities that were living in Canada. That's not really following the golden rule now, is it? And when we moved and we went through time to 2008, when we heard about the government apologizing, the Prime Minister apologizing to Indigenous peoples for the many hurtful things that the Canadian government has done, is that sort of following the golden rule? Well, this apology was certainly one step in the right direction. And in fact, many churches and other people that were involved in the residential school system have put out similar apologies. Or as the Presbyterian Church in Canada did, we confessed to God that we had not been following this very important rule to love others the way we want to be loved. And so the exciting thing about all of this, about this process called reconciliation, is that we're just beginning. And every day when we learn more about the world and when we learn more about our Indigenous brothers and sisters, we can make a choice every day to share that knowledge and also to choose to love others the way we want to be loved, following this really important lesson from the gospel. And we can choose every day to be friends, to be kind, to love one another, and to have respect for one another. And so that's what I hope you take away from this activity. If you'd like, I'd love to see a picture with you with your pin on, or even a video of you talking about what the blanket exercise was like for you. What are some of the things that you learned? And I'd love to share that with the rest of our Sunday school families at the beginning of next week's video. So we'll see you then.